It's Wednesday, December 13th, 2023. This is Ashton Ellett here with another installment of the Documenting Congress Oral History Project, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia. I'm here today on the campus of the University of Oklahoma at the Carl Albert Congressional Research and Studies Center with Professor Mike Crespin. He is currently the director and curator here at the Carl Albert Center, as well as professor of political science. Crespin earned his bachelor's degree in political science from the University of Rochester, a master's in political science from the University of Georgia and Michigan State University, and his PhD in political science from Michigan State University in East Lansing. He also served as an APSA fellow in U.S. Representative Dan Lipinski's office. His research focuses on legislative politics, congressional elections, and political geography, as well as Oklahoma politics. As part of his work here at the Carl Albert, he helps lead its graduate program, undergraduate research fellows, and Capital Scholars program. He is an author and has published over 30 articles and book chapters, and his work has appeared in such outlets as the American Journal of Political Science, the Journal of Politics, and Legislative Studies Quarterly. He also somehow finds the time to maintain the PIPC roll call data set and teaches courses on Congress and American government. Mike, thank you so much for taking the time here at the end of the semester where we all have the energy to do the fun things that we want to do.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Let's start at the beginning. Tell me about where you grew up and your early childhood education, stuff like that.
Sure. So I was born in a small town, Connecticut, near Uncasville, Connecticut. I moved when I was about 4 to upstate New York, so outside of Schenectady, a town called Glenville. It's a very small little hamlet. So I lived there through middle school, so probably in the early 80s. Then I moved to Chelmsford, Massachusetts for a couple of years. And then we moved back to the same town in upstate New York. So I was a bit of a General Electric brat,
Okay.
what I like to call myself.
Well, that answers the second question, which is, what did your parents do for a living?
Yeah, so my dad was an engineer, a little bit, most of his career was with GE, I think a little bit with General Dynamics, so kind of typical of that time frame engineers. He worked on submarines for military contracts, and then probably some other tank and airplane engines and whatnot with GE. My mom probably followed the typical track of women of that era. So she was, I think before I was born, was an elementary school teacher, and then took some time off while the kids were young. So I have a older sister and a younger brother, and then she had a career working for the public library in Schenectady. She ran a daycare with another one of her friends out of one of their houses. And then towards the end of her career, she actually went back to work for the county, and she worked for the Schenectady County Jail. So she was a clerk. So she was a civvy. She was not on the corrections officer side. Bit of a clerk. And so that's what they did.
So were your parents involved in politics, interested in politics? How did you get interested and involved in politics?
So my parents, they always voted. I remember as a kid, going to vote in New York. You voted in the old machines, where you'd go in, you'd pull the curtain closed, you'd click the things. As I've learned now, who knows what was being counted on the backside of the machines, and then you pull the curtain and your vote would be counted. But they were not political. We didn't really talk about politics with my mom and dad. I'd say a little bit, maybe with my dad and uncle and grandfather when we got together. So longer family history. My paternal grandfather came to New York City as a child around 1920 with his family.
Okay.
So he grew up and my dad grew up in New York City, and my uncle as well. So I think during family get-togethers for the holidays, there'd be arguing and yelling about politics.
What could be more American than that?
I like to tell this story that Bernie Sanders yelling is very comforting to me, because it feels like Thanksgiving. Oh, my family's together. And so there's probably a little bit about politics, but that really that's not the reason. I'd say my interest in politics and political science came from college.
Okay.
So I did my undergrad at the University of Rochester, which is a very well-renowned university for studying political science, a very particular way of studying it. But I had some faculty there who I just really enjoyed their classes, and I changed my major from chemistry, if you believe it or not. Now, my grades in chemistry were a little bit of a push, but the classes were definitely a pull. So I'd say the one person who probably pulled me the most was Gerald Gamm.
Okay, yeah, I'm familiar with the name.
Yep, so he's a political scientist still at the University of Rochester. And I just really enjoyed his classes, and so I changed my major. And I always liked the idea of being a professor. You know, it seemed like a good job, right? You get to read and study and write and teach. You know, is it a real job? I don't know, but
for tax purposes, it is.
Sure, yeah. It's a career. I'll put it that way. But it's a different job than a lot of them.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think both politics and history kind of went together as an interest, and that probably pushed me into political science.
So what was it about American politics or legislative studies, Congress? How did you sort of gravitate towards that area?
You know, that was probably a bit of advisors.
Okay.
So I graduated from the University of Rochester in 1998, took a year off. I was a substitute teacher and a track coach for a year. Substitute teaching, not fun. Track coach, kind of fun.
You do have the cross-country build.
Yeah, although I never ran cross-country. I was a soccer player in track.
Okay.
And then I applied to graduate schools, and I went to the University of Georgia for a couple years. And while I was there, you know, I decided to apply to different schools for a PhD program.
Okay.
And I was accepted to Michigan State University, and my advisor there, he had a program, this PIPC, or Political Institutions and Public Choice, or we called it PIPC, was run by David Rohde, he's a very famous Congress scholar. And so he accepted me into his program, and so I kind of moved in that direction. I'd say, like, beginning was a little interested in media.
Okay.
But, you know, I have a theory about graduate school in that your interests are very much shaped by the professors you have in the first semester of graduate school. And so I probably had classes with Dr. Audrey Haynes at the University of Georgia, and then Dell Dunn. I don't know if you remember Dell, so he's retired now. But so a little bit of media from them, but then when I went to Michigan State, legislative studies.
Right.
So most graduate students study similar things to their advisor. And so that's
guilty
kind of
as charged here.
set me on that path, I guess.
So, what was the subject of your dissertation, and how did you arrive at that?
Sure. Yeah. Taking me back a little bit. So the big subject was redistricting.
Oh.
And how does redistricting, a couple things, like how can we measure it in perhaps a better way? And then how does redistricting influence both member and probably voter or donor behavior? So again,
sure.
I'm thinking back from 20 years ago, so a little sketchy. But I use GIS to determine how much districts changed in terms of adding new population to districts and taking old population and moving it to different districts. So prior to that, redistricting was usually measured as either just, it was redistricted, yes or no, and so every 10 years you just, okay, it was redistricted, and didn't take into account how much. And then sometimes we thought about how much has it changed politically without taking into account just like, hey, there's 50,000 new people in your district, and so we need to think about that as well. So I think that was one of the chapters. One of them was trying to determine, do members change their voting behavior when their district changes?
Oh, interesting.
But adding so there had been some other studies on that, and most of the answers were no. But what I wanted to look at was you have to look at a certain type of vote. So this PIPC, the PIPC voting database, coded votes based off of, were they a procedural vote, were they a final passage vote, maybe an amendment or something like that. So my theory was, when it came to procedural votes, members are just voting with their party, so how their district changes shouldn't influence their behavior.
Okay.
Final passage votes, though, is like, hey, is this bill going to pass out of our chamber? Has a real substantive angle to it, and so constituents are going to pay more attention to final passage votes and anything with substance than procedural votes. And so I looked at, my theory was members are going to, if you just look at the final passage or substantive votes, you're going to pick up change based off of districts changing.
Right.
And was able to uncover that.
Okay.
And then on their procedural votes, like, they don't change their behavior at all because they're in the same party.
Right.
So that was a little bit of an advance.
What did you find? What was the most challenging aspect of that project at that time? Was it technology that was a hindrance or a helpful factor? What was that?
Probably for me was the technology. So GIS now is more of now that's not all this way, but like my project, there's someone who has a website that you could click 3 buttons and my data would emerge 30 seconds later. When I was doing it at the time, it was a lot of hand entering data and layering district vote or district shape files on top of each other in a command prompt environment. It wasn't hard. It was just sort of tedious. A lot of political science data coding is just tedium.
Right.
Doing the same things over and over again. So I tell my grad students, like, you'll never have more time than you have now to just sit there and mindlessly code data.
Mm-hmm.
So lots of dissertations are a lot of like mindless data coding. So yeah, I guess for me that was it. The writing part then was just writing up results. I had, as I said, I had a lot more free time to sit down and could spend uninterrupted hours of time writing and coding data. And as a professor, it's harder to carve out that time.
Yes. Yeah, I always think back. It's like, in grad school I was so busy, and then it was like, oh right, no, I wasn't. I wasn't at all.
Yeah, you work a lot.
Yeah,
but you're busy. You're busy on usually 1 or 2 things, not 25 different things.
Exactly. And now you're talking about the shape files and coding. You can go on Twitter or Threads, and there's an entire community of high school students who can churn out like the most intricate heat maps and election maps, and you're just like, wow, things have changed.
Yeah. And the other side, though, the expectations of what you can do with data are changed.
Right. Sort of the joke I made yesterday. The vacuum will free us from household drudgery.
Yeah.
It just raises the bar. So, what's been the main focus for your research post-graduate school?
I've probably had different threads. So I continue to work on redistricting. I've written a couple papers looking at what happens when commissions draw districts versus state legislatures or courts,
which we're dealing with right now in New York, Georgia.
Frequently involved in either drawing districts or taking plans from special masters that they appoint. So I should say almost all of my research is with co-authors. So like lots of a big range of people I've worked with. So I shouldn't take credit for
which is very very much a political science thing. Mm-hmm. History, it's not unheard of to have co-authored or co-edited projects, but it's much more of a trend, a tradition in political science than history.
Yep.
Why do you think that is?
You're
just nicer people.
I think part of it is seeing ourselves closer to the quote unquote hard sciences or lab sciences, where there's a lot of collaborative research. For me, it's my training. So I mentioned I work with Dave Rohde. When he was a graduate student, the way they ran the graduate program is they basically threw a bunch of smart undergraduates in a room together and, work together. It was a little bit more than that, but a bit of organic of older graduate students teaching the younger graduate students, then you grow into that position. And then over the course of their careers, those people still worked with each other. And so some of my co-authors now are still my graduate colleagues.
Yeah, I noticed that going through your CV, and it was just like you could follow. You're like, oh, this is when you were at UGA, and like
Yep.
you've added the UGA branch and
Yep.
Michigan State and so on and so forth.
Yeah, my first job was at the University of Georgia, so I came back there, and one of my graduate school colleagues, Jamie Carson, was on faculty there, so we did a lot of work together. Then I took a break from them. Then I came here, and then after a few years, we hired Chuck Finicaro, who I also went to graduate school with, and so we do a little less co-authoring, but I think we're kind of back on that now with some projects.
I'm glad I heard you say his name because I've only ever read it.
Right. Yeah.
So it's like,
Yeah.
So, but yeah, Jamie just I think he just published a new book that's out. A lot of good press on that. So, sort of the analytical question about your research on Congress redistricting, and it's something that I get asked about, at Rotary clubs and stuff like that, is when was the last time Congress was so dysfunctional, and why is it so dysfunctional? Or is this just the perception?
So it depends who you ask and what you look at. So if you examine questions like how many either bills are passing, or probably a better way to look at that is like titles changing. So if you take a lot of small bills and put them into one bill and just count that as one bill, that's probably not a good way to count that.
Right.
But Congress passes about the same amount of important legislation now as they did in the past. And then the amount of that legislation that is, or sort of how bipartisan that legislation is also pretty similar into the past. I should say I'm borrowing from Francis Lee here. So this is Francis Lee's research. So one take is like, well, it looks messy, but like the end product is probably pretty similar over time. Now, if you look at things, the very recent, deposing of the speaker, right?
Right.
I feel like 1890s. I'd have to go back and
Right.
look at the years. It's happened in the past. We have a very fractured and factional Republican Party who's bringing that to the forefront when it comes to voting for the speaker. And honestly, I think a lot of that is more tactics than strategy than actual policy outcomes. Is Johnson going to be that different than McCarthy? If you look at like the final bills that are going to become law, like maybe a little bit, but not drastically.
Right.
So I think the Freedom Caucus or the Tea Party, they want to fight, and they want the fight to be public. And so different speakers are going to push that a little bit more.
Yeah. What I always say is that it feels like within the Republican Party, as you said, it's a very fractured Republican Party. And those divisions are heightened by the fact that that's a 2-seat majority now, or will be when former Speaker McCarthy retires at the end of the year. It seems like it heightens the fact that a large portion, not a majority, but a large portion of the Republican Party, in terms of its tactics and its strategy, is better suited for a permanent minority position or an opposition party that just happens to be in government.
Yeah, I think there's a part of that party that is more concerned about the fight than the outcome.
Okay.
Now they'd prefer, probably an outcome to be come their way, but they don't want that to happen absent of, I think, a very public fight. So
Right.
both within the party, but then, thinking about their constituents. So a question I frequently get asked is, why did a member do that particular thing?
Right.
My answer is usually, at the end of the day, it's probably because their constituents approve of it, right? So it is the voters.
Or don't actively disprove.
Sure, yeah, right. They're going to get reelected with those actions. And so why not do it if probably the active and vocal part of their constituency approves of it? So that's generally the primary constituency.
Right. Well, reaching back to your early days as a grad student, what role does the sort of media ecosystem play in that? Are you counting that as constituency or?
Well, so there's different parts. So one part, I think, social media and things that are wrapped up into that have made it easier to raise money.
Oh, sure, yeah.
So,
decentralize the process.
Yeah, and I'm going to borrow from a graduate student's research now. If you tweet things that are more populist, you can raise money off of that, and direct donations to you. Whereas maybe if we look back a little bit in time, members were maybe a little bit more dependent on the party. Not direct transfers of money, but helping with the fundraising apparatus.
Right.
I think. And so Twitter, other things now, makes it easier for some members to sort of exist outside of the party structure, and any threats to rein in behavior really, they don't land.
Right.
Because they're going to get reelected, they're going to raise their money, they have their own base that's outside of like the traditional party structure. So I think it's less, like Fox News is driving this than like members can do things that are very member focused and less party focused.
Right. Well, similar to that vein of questioning, tell me about how you got your APSA fellowship, and tell me about your time working in Congressman Lipinski's office.
Sure. So the American Political Science Association Congressional Fellowship is a program that's existed, for a long time. My advisor was an APSA fellow in the mid 70s. So it's been happening for a long time. So this program, it embeds political scientists who are early in their career. They could still be maybe a late graduate student or a usually pre-tenure faculty member, but not always. In Washington, D.C., it's frequently in a House or Senate office. You used to switch offices midway through. But
that's a pain.
Well, so it also used to be a little bit longer. So it used to spend almost a whole year in the fellowship, and now you start like really in January and go through the summer. You arrive a little bit earlier for some orientation programs and that sorts of things. So I ended up working with Congressman Dan Lipinski, who is a political scientist before serving in office, and is acting a little bit like a political scientist now. I think he's at a university in a visiting kind of position. I had a lot of freedom in his office, kind of to go to hearings. I spent a lot of time going to Rules Committee hearings because that was also part of my research.
That's what the cool kids were doing.
Yeah, understanding the rules and how the rules of Congress drive outcomes, and a lot of that is embedded in the rules.
What's allowed to come to the floor.
Sure, yeah. So I spent enough time going to Rules Committee hearings that the chair of the Rules Committee would recognize me.
Who was the chair at the time?
It was Dave Dreyer.
Oh, yep.
From California. He thought maybe I was a reporter or something, because at one point he's like, who are you and why are you spending all your time here? And I said, I'm just, I'm a
fair question.
I'm a fellow, but I'm also a political scientist. So, I learned a lot by probably watching that. It's a very small hearing room, probably one of the smallest on the Hill. It's a small committee with
there's like 13
members. Yeah. So it's interesting now having Tom Cole, who's the representative here in the Norman area, as the chair of the Rules Committee. So I don't know, it follows me around or something. I also lived in Pete Sessions' district in Texas.
Okay, yeah.
And I believe he chaired for a very brief period of time.
Yeah. I'm trying to think.
I think he was chair, and then he might have lost his seat.
He did. He Colin Allred, I think, beat him
and then
18.
Back, and I don't remember if he's still.
He is back.
Yeah,
no, he's back in a different district.
Yeah, I knew he got reelected, and I couldn't remember if he is still.
I think they drew a district for him.
That area's
after
growing.
Right, exactly. It's DFW Metroplex. Yep. You can always find a place to draw a district.
So I really enjoyed my time on the Hill. You as a fellow, you got enough access that you could basically go anywhere you wanted outside of closed meetings or whatever. I went to, there was I'm not going to remember which justice this was, but a confirmation hearing. You wait in a little bit of a line, and they let you sit there and listen to a hearing for a while. So it's nice to experience that.
What year were you there? 05?
05, 06, maybe.
So it had to have been Alito.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
It had to have been Alito.
Yep.
Yeah, because it was Alito, because it got pushed back because Bush nominated Harriet Miers, and that was a whole blow up, and then Sam Alito.
Yep.
So you didn't catch Potomac fever while you were there.
I did not. I think a couple of my classmates stayed.
The survivor story.
Well, I guess. So I mentioned this before we were filming, or brought her up. So I was a fellow along with Colleen Shogan, who's now the archivist of the United States. So she stayed, is now in a
did very well for
great position. There's a couple others who stayed. I'm not exactly sure what they're doing now, but I was always on the academic track. I had I think I secured my first job at the University of Georgia maybe in November or December of my fellowship year.
Okay.
So I don't remember if I flew from DC for the interview or exactly how that worked out, but I had the job lined up during the fellowship.
Well, if I'm not mistaken, Congressman Lipinski's papers are actually here. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah. So I worked in his office, and we retired. I kind of kept in touch over the years, and reached out and say, hey, we'd love to have your collection here with us. So I'm pretty sure it's all processed, and maybe a little bit of work done before it can be open to the public. But yeah, it's nice to have that collection here. So we're not just Oklahoma.
An elegant transition to the talk about here at the Carl Albert Center.
Sure, yeah, mostly Oklahoma, but not entirely.
Sure, yeah. Most people would not expect to find a suburban Chicago Democrats papers.
We have two Chicago.
What?
Yeah.
Henry Hyde.
What's that?
Hyde?
No. A much smaller, and now I'm going to forget his name. So he was the congressman who beat Dan Rostenkowski.
Oh. Continue.
He only served, I think, for a term or two.
Rosty.
And we got basically a phone call, from the former member saying, my wife says, get rid of these boxes. Will you take them, please?
People who aren't involved in archives will not understand how did you get this collection? Well, somebody was moving and they wanted to get rid of something.
Yeah, that's a pretty common. We're downsizing. I need to get the stuff out of the basement. Will you take this, please?
You will have no stronger ally than a husband or wife who's tired of these boxes. Right?
Yep.
So Rosty was Michael Patrick Flanagan.
Yep, that's right.
Michael Patrick, so he was Ways and Means. Rostenkowski was. I don't know about Flanagan.
Yeah. Yep. So yeah, I guess we do have two Chicago.
It's
we have a little Texas with Dick Armey. Helen Gahagan Douglas, California, the Pink Lady.
That's right. She's red down to her underwear.
I think we have a pink sheet that she kissed.
She's pink down to her underwear. That was it.
Yeah. Yep. So she was a movie star and kissed the pink sheet. So I don't know if her lipstick stain is still on it. But
that's cool.
That's more lore than fact. I think,
right. Well, tell me about what attracted you to the position here at OU.
I think this job for someone who studies Congress is a great job, right? So it's very focused on legislative politics. There's other parts of it that are exciting. We have a graduate program that our students get PhDs in political science, but we sort of recruit and train our own students, which is always exciting. Probably when I started, less interested in the archives. I didn't really do archival research. I kind of don't really do traditional archival research.
Most political scientists don't.
That's correct. One way I explain the Carl Albert Center is it's an endowed chair shared by 3 faculty. It's like one way to.
That makes sense.
So there's, in addition to myself, there's 2 other faculty. There's Chuck Finicaro, who joined us, maybe about 6 years ago, maybe 7 years ago now. And then Dr. Rachel Bloom, who joined us 3 or 4 years ago now. The COVID years are a blank to most of us.
The memory hole.
Yeah, so we all study Congress or parties or elections. Our students study similar things. So it's nice to have that group together, and then we have the resources to do things that maybe in other instances we might not have. So last year we took part in the cooperative election study, which is a big survey where it's 60,000 people are actually respondents in the survey, and you get to ask some of your own questions on it.
Well, for those who are unfamiliar, and it would be a real surprise, if they were attracted to this sort of oral history, if they weren't familiar with the Carl Albert Center. But who was Carl Albert, and how did this center come to be?
So Carl Albert was Speaker of the House from 1971 to 1977. Prior to that, he kind of went along what was the traditional leadership track of, you might start off as whip or maybe even a lower ranked position, and then majority leader, and you wait your turn to move up to the next position. Your turn was usually death or retirement due to age,
right,
for the person in front of you. But he was a member of Congress from the McAllister area, which is the eastern part of the state, which was called Little Dixie.
Yes.
Due to its sort of like Southern Democratic, and you can actually still pick up vestiges of that in sheriff's elections. There's a couple elections you can kind of still see it.
Is that the southeastern portion?
Yeah, that's right. Yep.
Okay, so like Wes Watkins' old
district. They say he's the man from Buck Tussle. Buck Tussle is kind of like a made up.
Fantastic name.
Place. Yeah, but I can even go back a little bit further with Carl Albert. So he grew up in that area. He was a very good orator. So I was going to say speaker. He was also a very good speaker, but rhetoric, sort of back in that time was considered a real art, and he was very good at it. So he won a number of speaking contests while he was in high school. Including one that was here at OU, and one of the judges of that contest was Josh Lee. So Josh Lee was a communications professor at OU, and then goes on to be a United States Senator.
Okay.
And so I wouldn't say Lee sponsored Albert, but helped move him along in his life. So Albert wins this contest, and he gets to go on a national speaking tour. So those things don't happen anymore.
What? Okay.
And one of the stops on the speaking tour was California.
Okay.
And I'll sort of come back to this. So does this speech in California, and back then this got written up in the newspaper.
What else was going on?
Yeah,
right?
There's an oratory contest, and these high school kids gave, maybe he was in college, I don't remember.
Sure.
Gave these speeches, and they wrote it up. And so he decides he wants a bit of a career in politics, and kind of follows the typical law path. So he's a Rhodes Scholar. Albert is. Josh Lee wrote one of his letters of recommendation. We have those here. A few years ago, we wrote to the college in Oxford that he did his Rhodes Scholarship or his Rhodes program at, and said, "Do you have his application?" So you can look behind me, and there's I think still a picture of a young Albert that went along with his application. So he eventually
it's not in the shot, but
correct.
for the viewer's sake, it looks like he's an 11-year-old boy.
Yeah, he was youthful, short, the little giant. They called him. I don't remember his exact heights, but he was not a tall. Not tall in height, I guess.
Well, most recently in the news, because Speaker Pro Tem Patrick McHenry,
correct,
who is not a tall man,
yes.
Taller than Speaker Albert, I'm sure, but switched out the chairs because he was dwarfed by the speaker's chair.
Yeah, I will say. I saw that. I looked for pictures of Albert in the speaker's chair, and he used the big chair.
Yeah. Well, so there you go.
He's not concerned.
He just had the footstool with it.
Yeah. So in 1946, Albert decides to run for Congress, and he campaigns around the area, and he wins. And this is where I'll turn back to the story of the California speech tour. He gets to Congress, and in his freshman class are Richard Nixon, and John F. Kennedy is also in his freshman class. So he gets there, and Nixon comes up to Albert, "Are you that Albert who gave that speech in California all those years ago?" So Nixon is someone who's looking out for, like who are important people.
Sure.
I guess, who potentially may be important people. So I don't know. I like that little anecdote of that meeting.
Well, it's funny how their lives just intertwine, and you get up to the 1970s with the Vice President Agnew's resignation, conviction for shakedowns or bribery or whatever it was, where Carl Albert, there was a real chance he was going to become president.
Yeah. So part of that story is the couch you're sitting on, which is not in the shot, but Albert was taking an afternoon nap on that couch when an aide bursts in and says, Agnew's resigned. We have a copy of Agnew's resignation letter is actually in that case over there. So you have to resign to somebody.
Right.
And so one of the copies went to the speaker. So I'll sort of jump ahead. Albert serves, he retires as speaker in 1977. And then 2 years later, a young assistant professor, Ron Peters, whose PhD is from Indiana, University of Indiana, was a young assistant professor at OU, actually studies political theory. He's a political theorist, and decided I'm going to try to start this Carl Albert Center. So got permission from the president and went to the Hill and kind of, he worked things. So most of the Oklahoma delegation was in favor of this, and part of our origin is we got a Department of Education grant that was the start of the Carl Albert Center endowment. So there's money from the federal government as a DOE grant. There's also legislation from the state of Oklahoma that provided some funding, and then private donors. So we have a recording of the sort of original kickoff fundraising donor of people in their powder blue tuxedos, including
to match the couch, I'm sure.
Gerald Ford was there. So Ford and Albert were very good friends.
Right. Oh yeah.
Yep.
Former colleagues in the house.
Yep. So that's sort of the origin of the center. And then it was built up over time. So I give tons of credit to Ron Peters for sort of having the gumption to start that.
Right.
You can imagine an assistant professor today like, hey, let me start this thing. I'm going to go lobby the congressional delegation. That I think that doesn't happen today.
You got to go through 7 layers of government relations to even do that.
Yeah. He did get I see the letters of permission from the president to do these things. So the center has started, it acquired we had some collections that are already at OU that became part of the center. And over the years we've built up some of the other programs, including the graduate program. More recently, so we're over 40 years old, so recent could be 12 years ago. We started classes where students do internships either in the legislature and the local community, and we've watched those students go on to have great careers. Some of them have held elective office. We have our graduate program where students have gone off and done really well. For some reason, a lot of them end up on the dean track. Several of our PhD graduates, have held dean positions over the years.
It's because they have an appreciation for procedure.
I think procedure and leadership.
There you go. That's the selling point, right?
There you go.
Well, here's an administrative question: Is the Carl Albert Center independent of the political science department, or is it because the faculty you mentioned are all political science, you included, political science professors?
So to dig into the administrative weeds, the Carl Albert Center is currently a dean direct unit within the Dodge Family College of Arts and Sciences.
Okay.
So I'm the director. I report directly to the dean. Our faculty lines, again, this is sort of digging into the weeds, are in the Carl Albert Center. So our budgetary lines are in the Carl Albert Center. But the 3 of us are political scientists, and we hold joint appointments with the Department of Political Science. So the classes we teach, we're not a degree granting unit.
Right.
So we teach political science classes with a PSC prefix. Our graduate students get PhDs in political science, and that's conferred by the political science department.
Right.
So we work with them on that. We work on a lot of things with the department, but you asked the administrative question.
I did.
Like we are a separate unit, budgetarily, administratively across the vast majority of things that we do.
Well, how has the center sort of grown or evolved since you came here in 2014?
This is my.
So you'll be your 10th year.
10th year. Yeah. I'm in my 10th year here.
It's a long time in academic world.
It is. It's the longest. It's actually the longest I've ever lived anywhere in one place over the course of my life. Yeah. Consecutively. I think there was a little back and forth. I think so. We've done some things. We've taken some programs that existed and we've continued them, and we've tried to grow them a little bit. I would say, in addition to, I've talked about those classes, we do a women's leadership program that we do annually, and that allows women who are in college in Oklahoma or from Oklahoma in college at another university across the country. So very few of them usually Oklahoma-centric. They come to OU for 5 days, usually in May, and it's a residential program, but has an academic component to it, and help women learn how to become leaders in sort of the public space.
Okay.
And that's been an incredibly successful program. So it's, same thing. We have women who go off and have like great careers. I was watching C-SPAN, as one does.
Right.
A member of our delegation, Representative Bice, was giving a talk or questioning at a hearing, and I'm kind of looking behind her where the aides are. I was like, oh, I recognize that person. So it was someone who had done a number of our programs, but the women's leadership one as well.
What sort of outreach do you do in Washington, for example, or at the state capitol, in terms of donor relations?
Sure. So in terms of the federal government, every couple years I'll make a trip to DC and try to meet with as many members of the delegation that I can. There's 2 large universities in Oklahoma, so Oklahoma State and us at OU, and Oklahoma State has a very, very good archival collection in their libraries. There's it's a little bit of a sidetrack, but there's certainly competition between the two, and then members of our delegation also have preferences, sometimes based off of maybe where they went to school.
Sure.
I don't know if this is really true, but I like to say, so the Inhofe collection, which is a great collection, went to OSU. I like to think it went there because David Boren beat Inhofe in the gubernatorial race of 1974.
Oh my gosh.
And David Boren was a long-time president of the University of Oklahoma. So like I tell that story. Is it true? I don't know. I mean, he did win the election.
Feels true.
Yeah. So maybe some long-term political beef that goes on. I try to visit the delegation to talk to them about giving their papers. We're working on the Kendra Horn collection. She has the deed. As if you work in an archive, like getting over the finish line is maybe the hardest part. The verbal, yes, I want to do that, is easy, and then getting the deed and the actual boxes in your archive is the hard part. I hope we can get the Tom Cole collection and others in our delegation. So that's the federal side. We don't really take papers from state representatives. So, we're a congressional center. We're limited physical space.
Everybody needs to have a collecting scope. It's got
if a member, so for example, Representative Bice, she was a state senator and now she's a member of Congress. I hope to. I think we're contemporaries in terms of age. She may actually be a little bit younger than I am. Hope to eventually acquire her collection at the end of her career. If her state papers come with her,
so if it's incidental to their work as a member of Congress,
then we would take it. So Oklahoma is a term-limited state, so members can only serve 12 years, and we frequently have lots of turnover in the legislature.
Federal, state officials.
State.
I was like, I don't know that federal can be.
Yep. So it's a hard 12 years. So you can't move from one chamber to the other and have your clock start over again.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So most members actually don't move, probably because of that reason. I've talked to a couple people, and they say really there's 2 advantages of the Senate. You just have to campaign less. because it's a longer term, 4-year compared to the 2-year term. And it's a smaller chamber, so things are a little bit different, but but pays the same. Maybe staff is like you get one person instead of half a person. So very limited differences. But my point of the term limits is we have a lot of turnover, and if we were to take state papers, we would very quickly become like state legislative research center,
Makes
not
sense.
a congressional. I would say like the biggest change, which is your original question, especially on the archival side, is I think it's 5 or 6, maybe 4 or 5 years ago now, we acquired the Cantor Political Commercial Archive.
Yep.
So the Political Communications Center used to be its own thing, similar to the Carl Albert Center. Its connection was with the Department of Communications. We had a administrative change in presidents, and he no longer wanted to continue the Political Communications Center, and they asked the Carl Albert Center if we wanted to take the collection. And so we did. So this is a collection of over 100,000 political ads, and I'd say maybe 65, 70% of them, we have the only copy. So
I believe that.
If you include the radio commercials, so like very early political ads, we have about 100 years of political ads. And the way this used to work is, a candidate will cut an ad. It's physically mailed to the studio, for the TV studio. The studio would play it, and they'd throw it in the bin. Because what are they going to do with it? Right? They'd have to maintain it. So Julian Cantor, it's the Cantor Commercial Archive, he said, hey, I should start collecting these things. So very early on, he would just maybe write to these studios, hey, could you send me a copy? Or there's stories of him dumpster diving, trying to just literally pulling these out of the trash. As the medium changed to tapes, which you could record over, studios would record over the tapes because tapes were expensive and valuable. So he would trade blank tapes for the ads.
Goodness.
Yeah, and he built up quite a collection. I don't know what maybe the original collection was 25 or maybe 50,000 commercials. I don't remember the exact number. He decided, I'm going to make some money off of this. And so he put it up for bid, and OU outbid the Smithsonian. So they I think paid $250,000 in the 80s. So, there's some inflation
That's
in
some
there.
real money.
Yeah, it's real money, as I tell people. And OU acquired the collection, and then Julian Cantor came with it as the archivist. And he, was...
That's a heck of a deal.
Yeah, it's a great deal.
Him.
Yeah, I think he taught some classes, and then was the archivist with the collection. And then over the years, the collection's grown. When we acquired the collection, we made a decision to no longer collect ads that are contemporary. So, there was a little period of time when it was still in the Political Communications Center. They were trying to scrape ads or download ads from YouTube, and there's just so many ads now that if we continued that path, I was afraid we'd quickly become a commercial archive that happens to have a congressional archive attached to it.
Yeah.
So you could get 100,000 ads in one presidential year if you take the congressional
outside groups, the campaigns.
Yep. So this collection is from presidential all the way down to I don't know. We have a dog catcher ad, but like if there was
Took
one,
the words right out of my head.
we might have it. So we acquired that, and then a couple of years ago, I, along with colleagues at Harvard University and Iowa, and he moved to Purdue University, wrote a National Science Foundation grant, along with our archivist, Jay Price. And we got altogether, it's a $500,000 grant to redigitize the collection, try to move it all online, and then use modern technology to pull information from it.
Right.
And actually, since we wrote the grant to today, with AI has improved tremendously. That the things we can do with these ads it's amazing. So transcripts, to pull transcripts from 100,000 ads, once the ads are in the cloud somewhere, is really like 24 hours,
Yeah.
maybe a little bit longer, right? But you just write a couple lines of code, say take this ad, pull the transcript, and it's a very good transcript. Whereas in the past, you'd have to have an undergrad sitting there at their computer trying to type it out. And my guess is the computer transcripts are probably better than what.
Well, we're right on the cusp of that at UGA libraries, Russell and Hargett Library, talking about how do we transcribe all these oral histories or Brown media. It's like we have all this news film, and now it paid off putting it off.
Even we're now at OpenAI Whisper 2 or 3, right?
Exactly.
When one of the people on the project, started, he's like, well, we now have a new Whisper that's 20% better than the other ones. We'll do it again. We can also do things like describe the ad. So you can kind of just type into the ChatGPT equivalent. I'm going to give you a commercial from 1950 for a presidential campaign. Give me a 10-word description of it. And it'll pump something out.
Now, obviously, people watching this, we still do quality control. And
But so one thing though, if you have 100,000 ads, and if you were to do this without the computer, then it would take years and years and years.
Yeah.
There's a group that did this, the Wisconsin Media Project. They would get the storyboards from an ad and have an undergrad sit down and type it up. So we're going to do validation. So we'll pull a random set of the ads and let students, say, is this a good description of what's happening here? But the ones we've seen are pretty good.
Well, one day AI will get so good that we will no longer in descriptions have unidentified man or unidentified woman. They will be able to do these things.
Yeah, so that's the technology change is a huge change. So our archivist Jay Price, he's working using AI to identify people in photographs. So you take a database of people that are known and run it against your digitized photography collection, and it'll tell you, like, I'm 95% certain, this is Richard Nixon or Carl Albert or John Glenn.
Right. It's a brave new world.
Yeah. So one of my pushes when I interviewed, was asked, like, what would you do to the archive? And I said, we need to make this accessible to more people, not just the people who can come to the center and sit down with the boxes. And so digitization is the way to do that. And so since I've been here, we got a very generous gift from former member of Congress and Ambassador Jim Jones. So we have an online digital platform. His endowment pays for that. It also pays for a graduate student to do some work to digitize materials.
I met yesterday. Very, very impressive young lady.
Yep. So we started to move materials online. So that, it's only a small percentage of the collection, and I should back up. I can tell my joke that people would come to the stacks and say, hey, you should really just digitize all of this. So not really knowing what goes into it. Yeah. And my response was always, why don't you give me $1 million? And my bluff was called.
Well, right. I mean, and that's something that, you go down to the stacks, you go down to the vault at the Russell building. And the vault of the Russell building is 30,000 square feet, about 225,000 cubic feet, high density storage. And people will say, how much of this is digitized? I'm like, the equivalent of 2 bankers' boxes?
Yeah.
Maybe?
So, we're a little better.
Right.
We're a little better than that, but not much.
Yeah, it is time consuming. It is expensive. Yeah. I think folks think that scanners are cheap.
They are.
It's like, well, yes, scanners are cheap.
Cheap scanners are cheap.
But, different types of media, onion skin paper, staples, metadata, which is the hard part.
Yep.
Storage space, all the things that,
Yep. So one thing,
the sausage factory, so to speak.
Yeah, one thing our archivist is really good at is, and we're just at the beginning of this, is getting AI to do the metadata. So if you can automate as much of the process as possible, there'll probably be a trade-off in terms of accuracy, maybe a little bit. But if you can beat that in time and budget, so like we operate under real budget constraints, right? So we don't have an infinite budget. We all have time constraints. We will not live forever. And so there's much of this as you can automate, you can just start doing it faster and faster and faster. And I think even in the last 6 months, my archivist, Jay Price, has made like huge advances on that. And even, have someone validate what they're doing.
Well, that's, I need to talk to Jay about giving a talk to ACSC, our sort of consortium or group of associations that do congressional research and studies. What have groups like ACSC, what's the value of organizations like that to sort of bring together folks like you, me, and others?
So the center joined ACSC before I arrived. It's a great way for centers like the Carl Albert Center, the Dole Institute, Russell, to get together and to learn from each other. You could learn best practices. There's also sometimes technical questions or like, hey, we have this deed. How do we do it in this particular? How have you done it in the past? And then most recently, and this is a project led by the University of or West Virginia University. We have this portal project where they had a start. So West Virginia Dole Institute. I forget if Russell was part of the original.
I know we are now.
I think so. Yeah. And then we've re-upped this with a bigger team where the Carl Albert Center joined this team. So this is a National Endowment for the Humanities funded project where we can all take our own digitized materials, put it on one portal that's shared, and then so you get more material in one spot. So we're in our part of that. We're in 6 months into our first part of that, and it'll be, I think it's a 2-year grant. The project has been around for a little bit longer because there was the original part of that, and as I said, West Virginia is the lead on that. So that's one project that's really spun up out of that, and so I think it's a way for centers like us to have an archive to really get the material out there and share it with more people.
To your earlier point, which is the future of archives is and I think you and I see eye to eye on this, but there's some contention within the field that the future is not folks physically coming to the stacks, to the reading room.
So as I've gone to a couple of the ACSC meetings, and I probably preface everything I say with I'm not an archivist, but so I probably see things different than an archivist, than the standard archivist. And not to say it's better, it's just different. Preservation is extremely important, and I would never put preservation at risk. But preservation absent access is just a bunch of paper sitting on a shelf somewhere, eating up physical space and budget space.
Right.
I give an example. So this commercial archive, we have maybe 4,000 of the ads on a YouTube channel, which is like not good for. It's not an archival system.
No, YouTube is not
by any
not
means, because YouTube tomorrow could say we're taking YouTube down. But anyways, we get over 10,000 views a month on our YouTube channel, right? So like we used to get, if we had 10 people visit the Cantor Archive in a year, that'd be a banner year. In a year.
Right.
Now we have over 10,000 views a month on a fraction. So I think once we get all of our ads online, like 25,000, 50,000. People love videos. Getting access to like constituent correspondence is probably less. People are less interested in that.
Very valuable research-wise, but in terms of consumer consumption, exhibition purposes, there's only so many ways you can display a Western Union telegram or a memo.
Right.
Yep.
And so, my theory on the access is access should not be just restricted to faculty who have research budgets. Now we have budget to sponsor usually about 6 faculty or 6 people, could be graduate students or
good.
Scholars, to come. We give them $1,000 grants to come and work in our archives for however long the money lasts them.
Right.
But having material online just really expands, and I think it expands beyond the scholar to just the general community.
Right. The democratization of the archives is a very important thing.
I think too, like accessibility. So we're we could help someone if they came, but like we're on the second floor of a building that doesn't really have an elevator.
As somebody who just drug up about 70 pounds worth of equipment, I can vouch it is, I could do it, but I don't know how many years I would like to do it, how many times I would like to do it. But yeah, you're right. Thinking about, has your time here at Carl Albert, how has that informed your work or your approach as a researcher?
I think this started with my congressional fellowship, but teaching this class where students do internships in the Capitol probably gives me like a better appreciation for politics, real politics. I spend a lot more time observing what politicians are doing at like a very small level. I don't know, I end up spending a lot of time paying attention to the Oklahoma legislature because it's here. And I teach a class every semester where students are embedded, so we talk about it a lot. Probably earlier in my career, I was probably more interested in statistics and methods and that side of it. And maybe I have a more interest and appreciation in, I don't want to say like practical politics, but
no.
In individuals, and that sort of wraps itself too into an archive where you can also get an appreciation for that.
You're slowly drifting over toward the humanities with your appreciation of.
I'm a co-PI on a National Endowment for Humanities grant.
There you go.
So,
all right.
There you go. I'd say I've although if you look at this National Science Foundation grant, like I still have a foot firmly in both camps.
But I take the point, especially that, I remember when I first started visiting Washington, politics was something you watched on TV, you read about, you saw on the internet. But you go there and these are real people having real conversation. I can still remember seeing a member of Congress that I recognized from TV standing outside in the cold smoking a cigarette. And I'm just like, that's a real guy, right?
Yeah, they're real people, regular people. Some of them, but yeah, they're real people.
It's a spectrum, right?
Right. Yeah.
Well, as we wrap up, what projects are you working on in your your personal research?
Sure. So we have this National Science Foundation project, hoping to get some of this material out there soon. Transcripts of the presidential ads. At first, we'll do the entire collection during the grant period, as well as some of the other.
You're not starting with dog catcher and
we're now
clerk of the court?
Yeah, start at the top and work our way down, I think. So there's that project. We worked on this project I mentioned with the cooperative election survey, and there's lots of different parts of that. The sort of paper I co-led with one of our graduate students was asking some questions about redistricting reform and voters prefer commissions to draw their districts or maybe the legislature. As it turns out, they're mostly concerned about winning. So they'd rather have, if a legislature drew the districts and they won, that's their preference over having a commission.
And if it was the other way around?
Yeah. So there's that project. There's a couple more out of there. I hope to work with one of our graduate students a little bit more on these like kind of reform kind of questions. And so if I've drifted anywhere, I like to say I'm survey curious when it comes to doing survey research. So that we'll get into the weeds here, but I was trained as an institutionalist, right? So you study the institution and the rules and the members. Another area of political science is, we would call it behavior. And that was more concerned about voters and their views and preferences over things. And a lot of that was done with survey research. But now us institutionalists are moving a little bit into the survey research. And so the question about congressional redistricting was using survey research. Maybe a little bit more in that area. And that has to do with how political science is changing, about how we think about research design and the correct way to sort of answer questions.
Or what questions to even ask these days. You're talking about surveys, and that made me think of polling and political polls. And the conventional wisdom now is that polling is completely broken, completely useless. either because of changing technology, screening apps on phones that screen out unfamiliar numbers, Donald Trump's introduction to politics. Are polls and surveys still useful?
I think they are. So surveys are, if we think about them asking individuals questions about maybe like policy, those sorts of things, that's a little different than trying to predict who's going to win an election using a poll. They are still useful. So I think we found in the Trump era, and sometimes just having Donald Trump on the ballot makes polling difficult. Probably the best answer I got of that is what we would call non-response bias. And so some people, and this group tends to be non-college educated whites, they're both harder to sample and they're less likely to answer surveys, even if you can kind of get them to do that.
So these are the hidden Trump voters, so to speak.
Yeah, they're not hidden because we know, like exit polling says, like this is a group that is voting for Trump, but they're hard to survey.
Right.
So higher education people are probably just more likely to answer a survey. Maybe they find that interesting. Maybe they're a little bit easier to reach. But there's a pollster data person who's actually an OU grad. He's done very well sampling these people. So he was able to get the gubernatorial campaign, or the recent one in Oklahoma, some of the local polls had it as a very close race, and the governor won, I think, by 11 or 11 and a half, and this pollster was able to get it. And he says, I do a much better job at sampling that people. Some of it's technique and some of it's probably budget. Like if you can just spend more time trying to get these people, it's easier. Not easier, you're more likely to get them into your sample.
Yeah, well, no, I think your original statement of having more money does make it easier in the long run.
Yeah. I don't know, you think back to 2020, I think the polls were like pretty close.
I think there are so many different polling outfits.
Sure.
I think that you can find better and worse polling companies than you used to, as when you've got Gallup, you've got Roper, you've got, I don't know, Quail. I'm trying to think. You go back to the 70s and 80s. There were not 100 different polling firms. Every university now has, not every, most universities, not just the small colleges up in your
Quinnipiac,
Quinnipiac, Siena, Marist, Suffolk, Emerson. Those small liberal arts colleges in the Northeast. That there are going to be more misses, and you can always point to them.
Yeah, I mean, I guess when I say that they were fairly accurate, I'm talking about aggregate, right?
Yeah,
so
right.
On average,
the poll of the polls.
Yep. Even 2016, we Nate Silver, sort of one of the original aggregators, I guess. There was others before him. I think before Election Day said there's like a 30% chance that Donald Trump's going to win.
Yep.
And his outfit, they tried to how do you talk about 30%?
Right.
And I think the description he gave was the chance that NFL kicker misses an extra point. And, so I talk about that, and I say, a way to think about that is if you sit down on a Sunday and watch football all day, you're probably going to see a miss.
Yep.
And so, 30%, it's not zero. So a lot of pollsters really did miss that one, right? They said there's a 99% chance Clinton's going to win. Those are more aggregators, I think, than individual pollsters.
Right.
We can't probably talk about them. But some, hey, look, there's a chance, and it's not zero.
Right. I think I heard, it was one of the Nates. It was either Nate Silver or Nate Cohn from New York Times, who said, if I told you had a 30% chance of getting hit by a bus and killed, would you walk out your front door? And it's like, absolutely not.
Right.
I wouldn't do that. But I think the point holds that maybe polling's not broken or surveys aren't broken, but the American public's understanding of probability.
That's always been poor.
Right?
That's always been bad, yeah. Yeah. People, I don't want to say they believe what they want to believe, but like they.
Well, I think there's certainly confirmation bias.
Yep.
Yeah. So, well, I don't want to end on a conundrum like that or anything like that. But is there anything else you would like to add before, for posterity or the future? Any predictions you like to make? We can look ridiculous many years from now.
I don't want to make any predictions. I'll predict that the host university will win a national championship in football again within the next 5 years.
Well, that's I would say either one of us will be pretty good.
As my university moves into the SEC to join the host.
That's right. We've got the expanded SEC and the expanded college football playoffs next year. It's like with AI in the archives, it's a brave new world.
It is. Yep.
Well, thank you so much
right.
for this interview and the time and everything you do for the documenting and study of Congress.
All right. Thank you.